Dear FinCop members, PULSAR FINCOP members, and dear guests, Abbas, Kizilbash, and myself and our PULSAR FINCOP team are very pleased to invite you to join our first smart interactive talk. This is a branded PULSAR FINCOP branded event for virtual workshop. The topic of the virtual workshop is accrual budgeting, advantages and disadvantages. This topic has been established by the FinCop when the priorities of the FinCop has been discussed. There is a major debate regarding the role of the accrual budgeting in the public sector, the importance, and whether there is any linkages and impact on accrual accounting and accrual accounting reforms. And this is particularly relevant topic for all of you because you are the accrual accounting policy makers and reform leaders, and this topic is important in order to inform your decision making and plan the sequencing of the reforms. The key advantage and disadvantages of accrual budgeting we're going to discuss and cover today. While there is an apparent consensus that on the need and value of accrual accounting, today we are going to explore the introduction and most importantly the timing of accrual budgeting, and we are going to clarify that. The virtual workshop today is going to also elaborate the key practicalities of accrual budgeting reform and introduction. We will hear the recent updates and developments globally and the lessons which will be applicable for PULSAR member countries. Among those, we will cover the sequencing and implementation complexities. Today, I am very pleased to introduce our two distinguished speakers. It is Andreas Bergman, who is a full professor of public finance and director of public sector at Zurich University of Applied Science. He has been with the IPSAS board since 2006, and he was Andreas was chair of IPSAS board from 2010 to 2015. He's a scientific advisor on public financial management reforms in Switzerland, Europe, and broader Central Asia and broader around the world. Our second speaker is Gerd van der Linde, who is also very experienced in accounting the accrual budgeting reforms. He's a general internal auditor in South Africa and a member of the Chartered Institute of Public Finance in the UK. Since 1985, he became associate professor in auditing in the University of Pretoria in actually 1989, and then joined Ernst & Young Management Consulting Services. Gerd was actually the first accountant general in democratic government in South Africa, starting July 1995, when he was for 5 years has been leading public financial management operations and very key reforms in South Africa Republic. In 2003, Gerd has joined the WorldBank as lead financial management specialist based in South Africa. Today event we have connected 14 country offices, and now I would like just to move to the first session and ask Andreas to present and to share his experience on what is accrual budgeting, its advantages, disadvantages, and what is the fiscal management considerations, key benefits of accrual budgeting, and bring us and share with us select international examples and sequencing considerations.
So I'm very pleased to go through my presentation. Perhaps, as you have heard in the CV presented by Arman, I was involved indeed in the implementation of accrual budgeting as well as accrual accounting, as most of you will know, in Switzerland as well as in other countries. So today, this afternoon, the focus, of course, will be on accrual budgeting, so not on the topic you have probably met me first, but rather on the other side, on the budgeting side. I will firstly have a look what is actually accrual budgeting. So is there any definition or any common sense we have on the term? Then the main element, of course, is advantages and disadvantages. Then how to implement accrual budgeting. And finally, I will draw some conclusions. Now, the definition, there is actually not sort of a very general definition. I think best analyzed is the phenomenon by the OECD, who did a study in 2016. So 2 years ago, they asked OECD member countries, which are essentially all the Western European countries, but of course also some of the Eastern European countries have joined the OECD in the meantime. And then, of course, North America, the Far East, such as Korea, such as Japan, but also 2 Latin American countries, Mexico and Chile, are members. So they asked them, and how do you deal with the phenomenon? And they really had to differentiate between, firstly, accrual forecast and accrual appropriation. So what is a forecast? A forecast is basically if you make a projection, what will be the end year result of your accrual financial statements. And accrual appropriations, that's really the budget appropriation, so the decision that you may spend a budgeted amount, or you may also have in accrual accounting, of course, and in accrual budgeting. I was explaining that appropriations are really the budget authorization which is made on the accrual basis. So that's the first differentiation. The second differentiation is that, some countries actually do have some partial accruals and not full accruals, but partial accruals. So they would, for instance, budget for depreciation, but maybe not for other things, or then they would budget for say social benefits, but not for depreciation. So that is partial. So bottom line, there is quite a degree of shades of gray. If you look at which countries are actually using full accruals budgeting, there are only 7 countries using that in full. That's Austria, Australia, Canada, Estonia, New Zealand, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Then we have a number of countries which are using partially accruals, for instance, Chile in South America, the Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Finland and Sweden, but also the United States of America. So that's the shades of gray I mentioned before. They will budget some items on the accrual basis, whereas they budget other items only on the cash basis. This is really a slide about the motivation we had in Switzerland to introduce accrual budgeting. There was a very strong sense that there is a political rationale, and the political rationale, probably that's the one which is debated in Parliament, which is debated maybe also in the fiscal policy departments of the government. And they traditionally focus on cash. So they want to see basically, and that's what I mentioned in the bracket, they want to spend on behalf of the voters. So if you're elected, then I think really the managerial rationale, that's more the administration, but of course increasingly also politicians are interested in efficiency and effectiveness, or in the use of capital. So they want to see, for instance, what is the cost to treat one patient in hospital, what is the cost to educate a student, what is the cost to have a prisoner locked up in the prison. So that's a managerial rationale. And so we have both rationales. So we have, and that's of course a slide you know, we have to make sure that we can provide information on both rationales throughout the process. So that is basically the reason why we introduced both budgeting, and accrual accounting in the same moment, because we said, well, I mean, if we need both rationales for accounting purposes, we certainly also need them both for budgeting purposes. And of course, then the auditors need to verify also both rationales in the same time. And of course, for GFS these days, you also need both cash and accrual information. So this slide really shows that in Switzerland, and I'm still staying on the Swiss example, the budget on the left-hand side and the financial statements on the right-hand side are looking exactly the same. So the structure, the sort of the context is exactly, the content is exactly the same. So you will start with the comments. That's basically the government explaining why you spend so much or so little. Then you have the budget. You have a budget cash flow statement, of course, and you, of course, still have a cash flow statement in the accrual financial statements, but then you have an income statement on the accrual basis, and you have a budget income statement on the accrual basis on the left-hand side. Basically, the only item which you do not have as part of the budget is the balance sheet. So they do not in Switzerland produce a budget balance sheet. That's only in existence in the financial statements. But then again, you of course have notes, you have indicators, you have the proposed resolution. So basically that's the proposal to the parliament which they should vote on. And by showing this, it's already clear they vote both on cash and on accrual, because they vote on a cash flow statement, basically on the budget cash flow statement when they prepare the budget, and on the actual cash flow statement when they approve the financial statements. But in the same votes, they also approve the budget income statement, which is the budget as such, and they, of course, at the end of the year, approve the income statement on the accrual basis. So basically the vote, the proposed resolution includes both the cash and the accruals dimensions, so both the political and the managerial rationale. And then, of course, you go down to the entities and to the statistics, and you also have there exactly the same structure. The only difference, again, the second one is that the medium-term expenditure framework is only published as part of the budget, but not as part of the financial statements. But then again, of course, the audit report looks at the financial statements. How does it work in practice? I mean, if we talk about appropriations, about the authorization to spend, traditionally on the left-hand side, we just had a cash effect. So if for instance, the Ministry of Defense wanted to spend 1 million for something, they had to put this 1 million into the budget, and if the budget was approved without changes, they had the appropriation for 1 million, and they were allowed to spend 1 million, and that was the FE, the financial effects credit, basically. That's what you see on the left-hand side. Now, after changing to the accrual basis, if the Ministry of Defense really wants to spend 1 million in cash, for instance, to purchase some services, then they would, of course, still have to budget that cash effect. However, if they want to budget, for instance, for depreciation, so if it's not an in-year expense, but if it's for instance depreciation on vehicles or depreciation on buildings, then they of course also need to budget what is called WOFE, without financial effects, WOFE. So on top of the cash effects, they also need to budget the depreciation, or also if they have to make a provision, of course, they would also budget a provision in WOFE. And then, of course, they also have to budget for internal service charges, because the managerial perspective also takes into consideration if inside the government there are service charges. So, for instance, if the Ministry of Defense purchases IT services from the Ministry of Finance, they will be charged, and they also have to reflect this, but that's just an internal service charge. So basically the change is that after introducing accrual accounting, you have three types of budget credits. You have the financial effects credit, which is exactly the same as previously. You have the WOFE credit, and you have the service charge credit, which has been introduced additionally. Now, really talking, and I want to move about advantages and disadvantages. I have to tell you, I'm a professor, as I had been introduced, but really there is very little to know empirical work. So if you look at scholarly journals, at research conferences, you find very little about that. There is a bit of descriptive work. For instance, Isabel Brusca from Spain did a bit of work on that, and Eugenia Caperchioni on behalf of FI, the Federation of European Accountants, also did a bit of work, but further back in 2007. But it's only descriptive work, so also Isabel Brusca only wrote a description. There is some anecdotal evidence on advantages and disadvantages, but no statistical data. So that's why, with the next slide, I go into the anecdotal evidence. The anecdotal advantages to start with. The first advantage is really coherence between budget and accounting. And I think this was the main selling point in Switzerland. We asked the parliament, but do you want to have a different budget from the accounts? And they said, no, we want to have a coherent budget following the same structure as the accounts. And so that this was really a critical advantage. More economically, I think it is important, that's the second point, that actually if you build up or if you use up the wealth, it is mirrored. So if you, for instance, sell property, or if you have buildings which are deteriorating in condition, of course you will show a lesser wealth, and of course that's being mirrored only in accruals. Then of course investments are not treated the same as consumptive expenditure. So if you invest in a building, build a new building, a new school, for instance, or a new airport, you will show that in a different way from consumptive expenditure if you, for instance, hire a consultant. Then, of course, we do also see that there is a lesser likelihood, a lesser probability of political cycles, because what we have observed in a cash system is quite often that, for instance, before elections, politicians are tempted to spend a lot, and right after the elections they stop spending, and so we have political cycles, and these are of course disadvantages, and actually accrual budgeting helps to stabilize such political cycles. Again, that's anecdotal evidence, so it's not an empirical proven relationship. And also, and I think this is the last point, and that's very important for the managerial perspective, you can actually calculate the cost of the provision of service. So you can already in the budget say how much will it cost to educate a student, to treat a patient, to lock up a prisoner. Provision of services and the related costs, you may say, well, that's maybe not so important for politicians. My experience, and that goes further back in my CV, is rather the contrary. Before I went back to university, actually, I was working for the state of Zurich high school system, so I was the deputy director, the deputy head of that high school system. And we largely didn't know what is the cost of the provision of that service. And we assumed that because all high schools use the same curriculum, the cost must probably be about the same for all schools. In the canton of Zurich, we had something like 25 schools at that time. And so we thought, well, all of them must run at about approximately the same cost. It was really a shock to us when we for the first time did accrual budgeting and accrual-based costing, when we found out that actually the most expensive school was about 250% of the cheapest school. So 2.5 times the cost per student at the most expensive school as compared to the cheapest, and that with an identical curriculum. So the students learn the same thing, but at some schools it costs 2.5 times. And of course that was not something sustainable, and therefore that was one of my key tasks then to standardize the costs around 120% for all. So we could actually increase the budget of the cheapest schools quite considerably, about 20% increase. But we had to cut the cost of the most expensive schools also quite considerably. So all in all, this was a period of austerity. We could still provide increases in budget to some, but of course had to reduce the budget for others. And that was only possible because of accrual budgeting. Now there are, of course, also disadvantages, but exactly as the advantages, there is no statistical proven evidence. It's more anecdotal. So, well, some people say, well, it's more complex. Of course, yes, in a certain sense, it is more complex because it includes not only cash but different elements. But as I said, I mean, it's also then on the same structure as accrual budget, as accruals. The accounts and budgets are on the same structure. So that can be sort of be debatable. The second point is really that politicians and economists have low interest, and I can certainly subscribe to the economists, because the economists, and that's the slope you can see of the graph on the bottom, they have something called the aggregate demand theory, and so they basically are interested in what is the aggregate demand triggered by cash spending of the government. And that will consequentially, and some of you might remember Economics 101, that somehow relates to the ISLM model and the ADAS model. And so arguably, this is important information for macroeconomic theory and for macroeconomic analysis. However, I'm a bit more cautious actually if we talk about politicians, because I'm not so sure if really all the politicians think in ISLM models. I'm rather of the opposite view, and therefore I think perhaps for politicians this is not holding true. Also, there is a theoretical question mark, because there is a sort of a liquidity reference assumption which is not maintainable in those models. But all in all, yes, of course, there might be some resistance to change, regardless whether it's coming from economists or from politicians. So how to implement, actually, and that's now the last part of my presentation already. Well, I strongly recommend not to call for a revolution. Please do not call for the accrual budgeting revolution, but treat it as an evolution, so treat it step by step. Because I had made the experience in many countries that if you call for the revolution, you will scare away the economists for sure, and you will possibly also scare away the politicians, because they say, no, we don't want to change radically. And that can somewhat relate to their concern. But of course, you still have actually cash information, because if you implement accrual budgeting, you will have a cash budget as well. But you also have an accrual budget. So you have both informations in the same system. And in that sense, it's not really necessary to scare someone by threatening them to take away some information, because they will have the cash information as well as the accrual information. And certainly politicians really show some interest also in service costing and performance budgeting. You can imagine what kind of reaction we had in Parliament when we showed them that some schools operate at 2.5 times the cost of the other school, providing exactly the same service. So of course the Parliament was not at all satisfied with this, and was then of course really looking at the accrual budget more closely, because they wanted to monitor the full cost of the school rather than just a partial element. So really the recommendation is to build it up in parallel, be relatively silent, build up the two parts of the budget, and basically make it more visible once you have reliable information in place, and then of course say, well, but see how useful can accrual budgeting be. And then also please link it to asset and liability management, because this is of course another key advantage. So that's what I mean by evolution. So don't call for a drastic change all of a sudden, but really call for implementation of accrual elements, and once you have them together, then you can talk about it. This is another example, not from Switzerland, but from New Zealand this time. So they are probably the most advanced country in that, like in many other things in financial management. And so actually for this last year, published in 2018, for the first time the investment report became their main financial report. They still, of course, publish a balance sheet and a statement of the income and the cash flow statement, etc. But their main communication was relating to investments. So they were, for instance, looking at where is the wealth of the New Zealand government invested, and found out, for instance, as you can see on the slide, 7.4 billion are invested in defense, and 12 billion in higher education, etc. So that's of course interesting. But then they classified all those functions, whether it's a social function, so a function which serves the citizens or the enterprises, for instance, education, or whether it is a financial function which merely helps the government to manage financials of the government, or whether it's actually a for-profit function because the government also owns some state-owned enterprises. And that was quite interesting if you look at the effects, and the effects come on the next slide. So you don't need to see the details, but that's essentially the three groups on the right-hand side. So the blue is the social assets, and on the bottom part, the light blue is the social liabilities. So those assets and those liabilities which are related to the provision of service. In yellow or orange, you have the financial assets and the financial liabilities, so those only related to financial management. And then in black, you have the commercial assets and commercial liabilities. And so even if you can't read the details on the slide, you can see that most of the assets, more than half, are related to social assets, so to the provision of services to the citizens, for instance, schools, roads, things like that. But the liabilities, for the liabilities, it's only the smallest part. So the smallest part of the liabilities are actually taken up to construct such social assets. They're rather taken up for financial management purposes or then for commercial activities. And then, of course, you can also see on the left-hand side the social assets and liabilities by the various sectors, for instance, health or transport. Transport, of course, that's the roads. So quite interesting analysis, and that's basically how the New Zealand government now uses accrual budgeting information, because if you look at again the right-hand side chart, the last 5 columns are actually the budgeted columns, are not the actuals, and so they also use that for budgetary purposes. Let me come to the conclusion. So in my view, very clearly, the question is not cash or accrual budgeting. The right question is cash and accrual budgeting. So the accrual element is clearly an add-on. It's not something eliminating or canceling the cash, but it's an additional information. Second point, accrual budgeting is more important for managers than for politicians, but if you look at the experience with the costing, you will find out that also politicians are likely to increasingly use it. Initially, actually, the main use of accrual budgeting might be for service costing. But later, and that's the fourth point, it might also be to manage investments and assets and liabilities in general. That's what we have seen in the example from New Zealand. And finally, the anecdotal evidence, in my view, is mainly positive. There is some criticism, and certainly the strongest criticism is coming from the macroeconomists, who think they might lose something, but as we have learned this afternoon, the cash information is still there, so no one is losing any kind of information they are used to. It's just providing a more comprehensive picture. Many thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Andres. Now we are opening up the floor for questions. Please unmute your microphone and raise your questions, or just use the chat bar in the WebEx to provide your question. Andres, before audience is coming back with questions, there is one question connected to your presentation and your experiences, that many countries invest resources and efforts to implement accrual budgeting reforms prior to completion accrual accounting or in parallel to the accrual accounting reform. So what is your advice? Should accrual budgeting be introduced before, in parallel, or after accrual accounting reforms? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armin, for this very useful question. I think 2 out of the 3 possibilities are feasible. So you can do it in parallel. That's what we did in Switzerland. Or you can do it afterwards. That's what many people did actually in many of the other countries. But what you can't do, and I would strongly advise against, to implement accrual budgeting before accrual accounting, because you really don't have the data available. So either in parallel or after.
And in parallel, you mean that some part of accrual accounting is implemented and then that part is accrual budgeting is implemented, or it can go like both at the same time? Just to elaborate, please.
Oh, it can be both at the same time. I mean, in accrual accounting, IPSAS B is providing a transition time of 3 years in IPSAS 33, as we all know. So typically, you would apply the same period of transition, of course, also for the accrual budgeting. And of course, in those 3 years, you have to put on some bells and whistles and say, well, that's a period of change, so you will see changes, but then it's important that you stabilize the system again after the 3-year period and have a stable basis of both budgeting and accounting, and I think that's more important. Generally, my view is that politicians, they can live with a period of uncertainty such as 3 years, but of course they are not really willing to see changes over 10, 15 years.
Thank you very much. My next question is about, Andreas, you made an important point regarding the transition to accrual budgeting as the main model only after its value has become fully visible. In the larger Swiss experience with modified accrual model for almost 20 years, has value been visible to key users and stakeholders of the information, key users of the information?
Yeah, I think it is actually wider because certainly, if again, I might take the high school example because I'm most familiar with that one because I've worked on it very closely. So traditionally, for instance, it was mainly that the financial board of the parliament or the financial commission of the parliament which showed interest in financials. But when we talked about the cost of provision of services to students, then, of course, the education committee of the parliament also was very much interested. And so in that sense, it was widened. It was a wider audience, actually, we could attract at this stage.
Thank you, Andres. We got already questions on the chat. Andres, the question is, what will be the impact on fiscal indicators to reflect accrual financial information? Current fiscal indicators are often based on cash or a mixture. Often such indicators are not taking into account the net worth or wealth and do not distinguish between investment in productive or social assets. Mm-hmm. This is the question.
Again, a very good question. I think it's my recommendation is also to treat indicators as an evolution. So please don't take away indicators which people are used to. So if you, for instance, have an indicator on the cash deficit, please don't take that away immediately, but perhaps introduce a new indicator which works on the accrual side or which looks at the capital or at the wealth development, whether that goes up or down, as we have seen in the New Zealand example. But initially, just don't take away anything people are used to, but add something on. And then after a while, and that's the experience also in Switzerland, people say, but now we have these new indicators and they're actually more useful. So of course, then you can start turning off some of the old indicators and rely more on the new ones. So that's why I call it an evolution. So please just don't take away in fiscal policy. It's very important. Don't take away any information that people used to rely on, because otherwise they will get very skeptical. They get afraid of wrong decisions. So build the new system up in parallel, and after a while they will find out, well, maybe we don't need all of the old information because it's not that useful anymore.
Thank you, Andres. Questions from video participants, from video conferences. Tirana, because you have a translation in your office, would like, if you have any question, please just unmute. You need just to unmute so we can hear you. And other sides. Okay, then I will move with another question just received. It's the increase in complexity is highlighted as a key disadvantage for the introduction of accrual budgeting. In the Swiss experience, how was the complexity and associated cost of information presentation handled? And for example, what is the treatment of accumulated depreciation within the budget?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think how is it handled? I think that is really on the slide where you see the reconciliation between the budget and the financial statement. So that's essentially that's the sort of the second or third slide on Switzerland. I think it was of critical relevance that we used exactly the same structure and still use exactly the same structure for the budget and for the financial statements. So people can really look up the budget and find out, oh, well, we have budgeted amount X for salaries, for instance, and then look at the financial statements and find out, oh, and we have spent the amount Y on salaries. So it's really a one-on-one connection, and that requires, of course, the use of a unified chart of accounts. So that's a critical element to get that one-on-one relationship. So that was of critical importance actually for the communication part, and was actually reducing, I think, to a certain degree the complexity, because before you had reconciliations and then things didn't match totally, so people were more confused before than after actually. So that reduced the complexity. The cost, I mean, the cost for implementing it's yes, of course there was some cost. I mean, I cannot deny it. There is some cost involved, but it was relatively negligible. I must say it was maybe a few $100,000 Swiss francs or dollars additional cost, incremental cost. And if you look at the entire reform, which cost about 65 million, this is relatively little. The main cost was because of the IT. But that would not have been less if it had been only on the cash basis. So in that sense, really, I think the cost in the overall project was relatively negligible in Switzerland.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Colleagues from the video conference facilities, if you have any questions, please just unmute your microphone so we can hear you, because we receive questions from WebEx participants through the chat box. I will pass the floor to Abbas to moderate the second half of our meeting, and then we'll open and come back to you, Andreas, with Gerd, with more questions after following Gerd's presentation. Abbas, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Arman, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce Gerd van der Linde, who is a lead PFM specialist at the World Bank. Arman has introduced his credentials in detail, so without much further ado, I will hand it over to him to take us through his presentation on the pitfalls in accrual budgeting. In this presentation, he also addresses a very important question, and that is whether does accrual accounting necessarily imply a move towards accrual budgeting? And it's a question which comes up frequently. So without much further ado, it's over to Gerd to take us through his presentation.
Thank you, Abbas. Much appreciated. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation and to contribute to the discussion. Very interesting topic. Not many countries have actually moved towards the implementation of accrual budgeting, and there are reasons for that, which we'll come back to during the presentation. Now, if we just for starters and by way of a summary, I think I fully agree with what Andreas has said, basically making the conclusion that an accrual budget and a cash budget are two different types of budget. They serve different purposes, and it's not the one or the other, but perhaps both of them. And I think that's a very important point and a takeaway that I gathered from his presentation. Both are needed as they serve different purposes. But under the accrual budgeting regime, there are some issues and some pitfalls which I will touch on during my presentation, and those relate basically to the questions about appropriations, how to deal with accrual concepts under appropriation, traditional cash-based appropriation systems, and how does that then need to be modified, And then secondly, also funding issues, which we touched on a little bit. And there are some serious considerations that one would have to consider in the issue of do you finance accrual types of expenses, for example, and when do you finance that and how do you finance that? And those are the types of issues that I think needs a little bit more discussion. And then the last point that I also fully agree with, it's not a revolution, it should rather be dealt with as an evolution. And also just to make the point that under a cash-based, or let's say under an accrual-based budgeting system, cash-based data or accounting data does not disappear. It's always available and can be used to still report on a cash basis against accrual budgets. So what I would like to cover basically in the presentation are those points, just focusing first of all on the constructs of the cash-based budgeting system and the purpose that it serves. And then I think these questions, what is an accrual budget and how would it be different, has also been largely dealt with by Andreas. So I'll just make one or two additional points on that. And then try and reflect on the question whether accrual accounting necessarily imply a move to accrual budgeting and make a few points in that regard. And then some benefits and other considerations, if time permits, just to bring that into the discussion as well. On a cash budgeting system, the budget must assure fiscal sustainability and also fiscal stability. And the primary concern, as I think became clear from the discussions, is the cash flow impacts of government operations in the economy, and therefore the attempts in many of the countries to limit their deficits and also to manage their deficits and their debts on a sustainable basis. So therefore the traditional cash focus in the budget is understood from that perspective, and every policy choice that comes, for consideration for inclusion in the budget should be considered on a cash basis as well, from a point of revenue, expenditures, and also its debt implications. Additionally, the cash-based budget has an appropriation which is also based on cash. That appropriation is given in law, and budget execution is then tracked on a cash basis to ensure that limits set on a cash basis in the appropriation law is maintained. And therefore, you also have the idea that annually cash-based spending authorities would lapse, and the new budget, once approved, would result in a new expenditure appropriation in law, which becomes the basis for measurement on a cash basis in the subsequent financial year. So those are some of the key constructs, and I think we should just keep that in mind when we talk about accrual budgeting and how does it differ. Key points here would be managing deficits, limiting deficits, and managing debt to make sure that you sustainably run government on a financial basis. Now, an accrual budget, first of all, I think accrual is basically, as we all know, to account for financial impact of transactions, irrespective of cash flows. First of all, to understand that as a concept, which is different from under the cash-based accounting and budgeting systems. When I thought about, and when I started to read up on accrual budgeting, I was never taught when I was at university about an accrual budget. I know about operating budgets and I know about cash flow budgets, but I think the term generally is interpreted in the public sector at this point in time to mean an operating budget, which is constructed from cash flow as well as non-cash impacts of transactions. And therefore, it's an operating budget more than I would call it an accrual budget, and it measures something different compared to the cash flow budget. As I've already said in the previous slide, one of the main indicators under the cash flow budgeting system would be deficit. Here, we actually would have a deficit that means something different. It's not a cash deficit. Your expense control totals need to track expenses on an accrual basis, not just on a cash flow basis. And as a consequence, any resulting deficit in such a budget can no longer be interpreted as a cash flow deficit, but only as a measure of the extent to which revenues cover operating costs. And therefore, I think it's appropriate to also refer to it as an operating budget. What would be different would be that the expense control totals, I mentioned this in the slide before, it would have to track expenses that are on an accrual basis or accounted for on an accrual basis, including things like inventory and depreciation. But you would also then have to budget for these types of expenses, and you have to limit them in terms of the appropriation authority that would be given in law to the spending units. It no longer presents a cash deficit or a cash surplus, but an operating deficit or an operating surplus, measuring the cost to run government rather than the cash deficit or the cash surplus. And it would appear, as Andreas has also indicated, that there might be an interpretation that direct control over cash outcomes will be lost, which is not true, and we have to manage that perception. It becomes extremely important to monitor the ministry accounts ex post. And one key question that I think we need to further debate is whether such non-cash expenses should be funded and how should it be funded and when. I don't think we've adequately have that question debated at this point in time. Does accrual accounting necessarily imply a move to accrual budgeting? It's basically to ask of any businessman, would you let go of cash flow budgeting and cash flow controls if you have a balance sheet and an income statement? Obviously not. But the options, and I found these options when I did a bit of research on the topic. Some countries continue to appropriate and control cash and report cash expenditures in a budget execution report, which is different from a statement of financial performance on an accrual basis. Some countries include non-cash expenses in the budget, but they don't appropriate cash for them. The budget would present full accrual costs and cash required, both. But then you still have to answer the questions, what does accumulated depreciation mean in the concept of budgeting and appropriation in government? Does it become a future right to capital spending, for example? Some of these questions are not well researched and not well answered. And then when you do fund them, non-cash expenditures, what are the implications? If you run deficits and you have debt, what would you do with the cash in that particular point in time? How do you handle capital acquisition subsequently? These are all questions and pitfalls that I think needs to have very clear answers before you start to implement accrual budgeting. Benefits, I think these points were already made. Matching of revenue and expenses are more accurately done and determine the cost of operating government, improving the costing of services and products, improving the management of assets, working capital. I think there's a much better view on the accrual budgeting system about the impact of decisions on the long-term financial sustainability of government. And it could be a very good catalyst for performance-orientated budgeting and management reforms. And I don't think you can actually really implement those types of reforms well in the absence of accrual type information, which measures the cost to run government and not the deficits that you need to finance in order to run government. Some other considerations, I think it's very important to take account of your accountability arrangements under the two different budget regimes. Currently, under cash budgeting regimes, you have a particular view on accountability. And if you start to implement accrual budgeting, it may be broaden the scope of accountability to cover things like not just the revenue and expenditure on a cash basis, but also management of assets and liabilities, service delivery performance, control over public entities, and when you start to consolidate these entities and who's accountable for them, these are key questions that I think one would need to consider before you actually embark on the implementation of accrual budgeting regimes. Also, how to deal with new financial assets and liabilities, inventory and property, plant and equipment, having to develop the necessary accounting policies for those, determine the impact of newly disclosed financial liabilities and assets on fiscal stance, review current accountabilities and develop regulations for all of these new items that have to be considered and managed in the fiscal framework, and then also to develop a financial liability management framework for public entities other than your traditional statutory funds and other spheres of government, I think would be crucially important. I don't think that the focus on fiscal balance should diminish under an accrual budgeting regime. That should be retained. This question also came about, I think, during the questions to Andreas. What about the deficit measures? And I fully agree with what Andreas has said. Cash deficit measures should be retained. Cash deficit measures the ability to finance the cash outlays in a financial year with the cash revenue raised in the same financial year, whereas an accrual deficit measures something else. It measures the annual operating cost of government, including costs that are incurred today but not payable for years to come. And these are two different things, and they should be clarified as such. You should also be very careful with the interpretation and the use of new measures for consolidated budget entities, including measures such as net debt, change in net debt, surplus, deficit in the statement of financial performance, accumulated surpluses and deficits, and so forth. And these, I think, should be, once you start to change the system and start to introduce accrual budgeting with accrual accounting information, I think needs to be subjected to very firm guidance, not just to governments and to management and politicians in government, but also to analysts that traditionally used to analyze financial statements of government and budgets on a cash basis. Next slide. Some data issues, I think. I'm not going to go through this. I think important to, once you, and I fully agree relative to the point of implementation and sequencing of implementation, you can't do accrual budgeting unless you have accrual data to work with, but it can cost quite a bit of money to get that data and to get that data into IFMA systems. So I think one needs to be very careful in your approach in terms of what data should be collected and how to maintain that data, but also how to make sure that you have balance sheets that will not be qualified by the Auditor General because they don't agree with the approaches taken to collect the data. So very, very serious considerations here that I think one needs to take into account as well. And that's it. I think these were a few points in addition to those made by Andreas that I hope would add value to the discussion. Thank you so much, Abbas.
Thanks very much, Gert. I'd like to open it to questions from our participants who are on WebEx or VideoCon, or you can type in your question. Arman, if you could monitor the questions on WebEx, please, because I don't have the master control. While we are awaiting questions from the participants, one question from my side, which and this relates to your comments on fiscal accountability. And in that regard, if the budget remains cash-based and financial reporting transitions to accrual, isn't there a risk that the transition of financial reporting on an accrual basis will be considered to be a technical accounting exercise because the budget is a primary management tool for policymakers?
There certainly is a risk, but I think it all depends on how you manage the transition. And I think it comes back to the point about we're not talking about cash or accrual budgeting or cash or accrual reporting. Yeah. We're talking about cash-based budgeting serving particular needs and accrual-type budgeting serving another need. And it doesn't mean that when you move to accrual accounting that you can't report on a cash basis. Your cash basic data that you need to run traditional cash-based accounting systems on would still be available in an accrual-based accounting system, which you can then use to report on a cash basis against the budget. So it's different things for different purposes, and I think that needs to be very clear amongst the stakeholders when you start to implement a change from cash budgeting or not cash to accruals, but cash and then accrual budgeting. You need to clarify the different purposes that these types of budget serves, and the main point being that you can still report under an accrual accounting regime on a cash basis.
Gert, another question from my side it relates to the uptake of accrual budgeting across the world. And I think you mentioned early in your presentation that there have been a limited number of countries that use full accrual budgeting. So what in your view are the main reasons for this?
I think primarily two reasons. The one is the very important need within most governments to control cash deficits and their debt and borrowings. And therefore, and because the traditional cash-based system, the accounting system has served its purpose, they are hesitant to let go of those types of controls that they have in place to minimize deficits and to therefore also ensure that they don't put government into a situation that borrowings are unsustainable. And then secondly, that many of these countries, I don't think fully appreciate the use of accrual type budgeting, especially in the context of performance improvement. And those reforms have perhaps not advanced to such a stage where accrual type information would be of value. So those would be the two main points. There's the need, and that need will always be there from my perspective. Control deficits on a cash basis, control borrowing government, and then secondly, when you're ready to start to focus on cost of operating government, how to improve efficiencies, and to minimize the cost of operating government, then you have to have accrual type information, and it needs to be used in your system of accountability before it will really take hold of systems in terms of implementation. Those would be the two main reasons as I see it.
Thanks for that, Gert. Arman, are there any questions on WebEx?
I don't see still questions. Just a second. There is one regarding a general one. It's about capacity building in terms of the staff capacity building, and what are the requirements? Is it going to target only accountants or budget officers, then ministers, managers, parliamentarians? How further and how intense, and what will the scope of the training for accrual budgeting before it is understood and implemented?
Yeah, I think obviously a question that I think could be debated for a long time, but certainly a move from cash-based budgeting and accounting towards an accrual type accounting system which also serves the needs of the accrual budget as well as a cash budget is complex. And it'll take quite a bit of time to build up the necessary skill amongst accountants in government to be able to do that. But beyond that, I think it's going to extend also to budget officers, it's going to extend to economists, it's going to extend to managers in government, because it links to your accountability systems and what you can, if you have an accrual accounting system and an accrual budgeting regime, you're measuring different things than the traditional cash-based kind of measures. And therefore, the use of that information from a point of view of financing and accountability and all of the uses that you have for that information needs to be well understood by all of the stakeholders. So I think you can't implement this type of reform without a really well thought through capacity building strategy, which takes account of technical skills needed, but also of the general understanding amongst your key stakeholders, including politicians and public, about what this information actually means. If you talk about an operating deficit or an operating surplus, it might mean that government still runs a cash deficit. How do you deal with that information? What do you make of it from a point of view of interpretation of fiscal stance? These are the types of things that needs to be well thought through, and I think you have to have a very good but a communications campaign in order to simplify it as much as possible and to make it, for it to be value adding. Otherwise, it might just become a technical exercise if you don't really succeed in making visible the real value of the different information that you have under an accrual budgeting and accounting regime.
About one more question. Abbas?
Yes, I can hear you, Arman.
Yep. One more question is to Gert and Andres, is that we are still struggling with implementation of accrual accounting reform in a resource constraint and staff constraint environment. What would be your advice? Shall we also start to explore accrual budgeting at this stage, or only after we make a significant and measurable progress on accrual accounting reform, we can move towards accrual budgeting reforms?
Well, let me start and then perhaps ask Andreas to also contribute. I think these things, as I've indicated, is bound to cost money in terms of data collection. If you want to do accrual accounting, you have to have that data. You have to have new policies. Your systems needs to be adjusted. People needs to be trained. It's a cost intensive, potentially a very cost intensive exercise. And I think it's critically important that the value and the use of the information that you will now have is clearly understood before you undertake it. Unless the value proposition is well understood, we should be careful not to just make it a technical exercise in terms of this is the way the world is going and therefore everybody should be doing it. And we have the standards and all of those things. I think from a fiscal management point of view, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to educate the public sector largely in terms of the value of accrual type information and how it should be used and for what particular purpose it should be used. Be it financing, be it managing of debt, be it management of assets and liabilities, all of those things. It's going to take time for that to mature. So I think the value proposition should be well understood before you embark on any such reforms. And very, very importantly also is not to let go of what works currently for governments, and that is controlling cash and cash deficits and borrowings. And I think that's critically important to, when you start these reforms, to maintain the ability to continue to provide that information. And you can do that in an accrual accounting system.
I think I fully agree with what Gerd just has said, but I would like to add just one or two more points. In the earlier questions, I've been asked whether you should do it in parallel or whether you should do it before or after, that you can implement accrual budgeting either in parallel or after, but not before. So there are certain disadvantages and advantages of doing it in parallel. The disadvantage clearly is, of course, it adds complexity to the project, and as I mentioned, while the amount is not big, it needs some additional resources. The advantage is that you have just one change. So, for instance, if you change legislation, you need to change it once and not several times. So that's the advantage of doing it in parallel. If you decide to do it afterwards, of course, you have perhaps a bit less of overlap in stress and in the reliance on scarce resources. But of course, you have the disadvantage that you have to touch the system twice and you have to change the system twice. And of course, that can also cause some confusion and some resistance, because people said, oh, but we only changed the system like 5 years ago and now we need to change it again. And so in that sense, I think both patterns, doing it in parallel or doing it sequentially, has some advantages but also some disadvantages. And I think it really depends a bit on the capacity. And I mean, in all fairness, looking at the PULSAR group of countries, we have differences in capacity and differences in resources. So perhaps some who are really already almost on full accruals and just make some improvements, they can well also do in parallel the implementation of accrual budgeting. Whereas someone starting really on a very low level of accounting maturity is probably better advised to wait for a second reform phase for accrual budgeting and firstly complete the accrual accounting, because otherwise your scarce resources would be stressed too much. And so I'm generally a bit cautious of giving a general advice which applies to all and each and every country, because really countries are different and therefore perhaps the advice needs to be tailor-made.
I have one question for Andreas, and basically he mentioned in his presentation regarding the Swiss experience with the accrual budgeting, and he mentioned that policymakers wanted the same basis. So they wanted budgeting and financial reporting to be on the same basis as one of the reasons for the successful implementation, the successful Swiss experience. But my question was it because they were already familiar with accrual precepts that they were amenable to the same basis for financial reporting and budgeting, or were there certain additional reasons for this? So I just wanted to pick on Andreas just to get some insights there vis-a-vis policymakers.
No, I think in Switzerland, really the federal government, and I was talking about the federal government mainly, was on a cash basis for accounting and was on a cash basis for budgeting before that reform. But it is decided after consulting the finance committee in the parliament actually that they wanted to do both at the same moment of time. So perhaps this gives us another insight. Yes, they did consult the finance committee in parliament. It was not a full parliamentary session because, of course, if you have a parliament of 246 members, both chambers in Switzerland have 246 in total, you will have a lot of members of parliament who are not really interested in that. So it was good to have the Parliament Finance Committee, and they consulted them, and the Parliament Finance Committee recommended to do both at the same time because they felt convinced by this rather than by having two different systems. So perhaps really also you need to include your stakeholders, and this includes, of course, in the case of budgeting, the parliamentary finance committees.
Thanks for that, Andreas. Yes?
Yeah, sorry, Gert here. Can I also just clarify one point that I think Andreas also made in his slide, and perhaps ask Andreas just to explain that a little bit further. If I remember the comparison between budget and financial statements, that slide correctly, you still have a cash flow budget and a cash flow statement under the system. So it's not that the accounting system does not produce cash-based reports. It does produce a cash flow statement, which is comparable to the cash flow budget. Am I right there? And then you have the other financial reports, which are presented on an accrual basis. And this, it's not the one or the other, it's both. Am I right? Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely correct. So you have a cash budget and you have a cash flow statement, as well as you have an accruals budget and an accruals income statement. And actually the parliament votes on both in the same vote. So technically the vote the parliament takes at the end of the budget debate, of course they take many votes before if they want to cut, I don't know, in defense or something like that, but the final vote when the parliament finally approves the budget is the question, do you want to approve the budget? And then the key figures both from the cash and from the accruals are repeated, so you approve a cash deficit and an accruals deficit, and in only one vote. So the president of the parliament basically reads out, do you want to approve a cash budget resulting in a deficit of X and an accrual budget in the deficit of Y? Who is in favor? Yes. Who is against? Okay. Who abstains? And then the parliament has approved both budgets in one single vote. And I think that's very critically important. So even within the parliament, maybe some members of parliament think, oh, the cash budget is really the only thing I need. Okay, that's fine. And other members in the parliament think, well, but the accrual budget is more useful for me, and then that's also fine for them. So they can vote in the same vote.
Thanks.
Thanks, Andreas. Arman, I believe you have two more questions.
Yes, there are two more questions. One is, should it go in parallel? I believe the question is about accrual budgeting reform to performance and program budgeting reform rather than accrual accounting reform. I believe the question is about connections, whether it should be packaged with program and performance budgeting rather than accrual accounting reform. Which is one question. And second, which is about, we are implementing GFMIS system currently. Does it have any major implication? So we need to pause with the GFMIS implementation and clarify accrual budgeting reform implications for the system, or we can come back to this element and module of the GFMIS later on. I believe to both speakers, because it was not indicated.
I give a start on that one. Perhaps the first question is related to performance budgeting. Just to be clear, if you want to produce meaningful performance budgets, you need accrual budgeting in place. So in that sense, yes, of course, you need to do it before you want to do performance budgeting. But again, I mean, whether you do performance budgeting earlier or later, that's something which, of course, can be debatable. And again, if you're really in a low resource country, perhaps low maturity country, you need really to be careful not to cause any overload. And if you're in a more advanced situation, of course, you might really consider to move to the performance budgeting, because that's really useful also for the politicians. So really, I think the advice needs to take into consideration maturity and also the resources available.
Thanks, Andreas. I fully agree with that. On the question of GFMIS system implementation, personally, as an accountant and auditor, if I have to implement a financial system, I implement such a system on an accrual basis, because you can still produce cash-based reports from it. Therefore, if there's a need to continue to report on a cash basis, it's merely a reporting issue that you have to then deal with from the IFMIS. So, but there are different approaches, and many would say if you set it up on a cash basis, your conversion to accruals would come as a second phase and so forth. But it all depends on capacity of staff to run an accrual accounting system and still produce cash-based reports back to budget as needed. And secondly, whether and it's basically a capacity issue. It's not a systems issue. Most of these systems, like SAP and Oracle and all of the others that we know of, would have the capability to produce reports on a cash basis, cash flow statements, and you can still run it on an accrual basis from financial assets and liability point of view and so forth, and even from a fixed assets point of view. But that's my personal opinion. Others might differ from me, but I really would invest quite a lot in the accounting cadre to make sure that they have the capacity to run an accrual system. And then as you then start to mature and evolve the budgeting practices and systems, that you can then, that you already have the data in place in order to do that.
Thanks, Gert. We have a question here from Alfred.
Yes, good afternoon to you both. In the question of the implementation and whether it should be parallel or whether it should be sequential, the answers seem to be around the capacity and the priorities and resources available. But I'm wondering if there's any research that you've been done. I mean, after being involved in several implementations, you may have your own views, and whether there's any evidence leaning one way or the other in terms of results and efficiency and effectiveness, I guess, overall.
No, I mean, the point is, I mean, I'm not talking as a scientist, of course, even though I've been involved in several countries, the sample is way too small to have a sort of a correlation of something which is meaningful in the statistical sense. So I would be cautious about that. But of course, I mean, it is, as you say, capacity is certainly one determinant, and the other one is maturity as well. I think that's really, maybe I did not stress that enough. The maturity of the financial management systems differs relatively significantly between the countries, even within that group of country of the PULSAR initiative. And so, of course, we have more mature countries and less mature countries, and so in addition, this is also something to be factored in.
If I if I can add to that, Abbas, I think in low capacity environments, as you know, from a practical point of view and from a point of view of complexity, I would certainly, if I had to run such a reform, I would not do it in parallel. I would do the accrual accounting reforms first and then transition to accrual budgeting. To tackle both in a low capacity environment because of concepts that are different and things that, well, many countries still struggle to run their IFMA systems on a cash basis, you know. So to attempt to convert to accrual accounting as well as accrual budgeting at the same time, I think is a tall order. Certainly not to be advised from my perspective, personally, in a low capacity environment. I would then rather convert to accruals and make sure that you maintain the linkages and the ability to still report on a cash basis, which is possible. And then as you start to settle down in terms of the accrual accounting systems and you have the data available, you could then start to think about how to introduce, in addition to cash-based budgeting, accrual budgeting and what its use would be, and then do the necessary capacity building and campaigning from that perspective.
Thanks a lot for that. Gert. Are there any other questions? If you could unmute your mics, if there are any further questions, or if you've missed any question that was on your mind and you want to ask the panelists, this would be a good time. If not, then let's conclude this session. And I think this is a complex topic that we started in PULSAR. It was identified by the participants. And as the capacities of the countries mature, and we will come back to this and explore it if necessary. I think the key takeaways for myself were the stress on was the interesting the discussions on sequencing, the parallel and sequential sequencing, the pros and cons which were discussed by Andreas, and the thoughts of Gert regarding accrual accounting, and then when you are in a sufficiently mature environment, then transitioning to accrual budgeting. I think the point about cash and accrual budgeting and the focus on the fact that cash information will still be available for decision makers was an important insight, at least for myself, and as well as Andreas's comments on showing the value of accrual budgeting, demonstrating it to service costs and performance budgeting. So we'll keep on exploring these themes in PULSAR based on the needs of our participants. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for their support for our program and for their time and their excellent presentations. And I'd also like to thank all our participants as well as our wonderful support team and translators who managed to pull this off. I had my doubts we'd be able to connect all or get this done so seamlessly as we have. So Arman, over to you if you have any last comments before we close.
Thank you, Abbas. Just joining you in thanking our speakers for excellent insights. Yes, I fully share that this is a very complex topic, and we may explore as the maturity of our country system, PULSAR beneficiary country system develops. On the WebEx and our virtual meeting site, I would like just to note this is the first time we run the meeting in 4 parallel language, and this is the smart part of our virtual event, and interactivity is just the way you raise your questions as the presentations were made. So that is Smart Interactive Talks is now running, and they are live, so we look forward to our next event. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you next time.